In the winter of 1911, a boy of 7 sat beside his father in the vast electric gloom of Madison Square Garden and watched men on horseback ride in circles across a floor covered with dirt. The show was Buffalo Bill's Wild West, already an aging spectacle by then, its founder growing old and its frontier long since closed. And most of the audience had come for the marksmanship and the stagecoach chase, and the comfortable thrill of a danger that had passed safely into entertainment. The boy, Joseph Campbell, watched something else. Among the cowboys and the cavalry and the trick riders, there were native men, riding bareback, wearing feathers and paint. And while the crowd around him saw performers, the child saw people who had come from somewhere he did not know, and who carried, in the way they held themselves, a knowledge he suddenly and unaccountably wanted. He would say for the rest of his long life that this was the beginning, not a lesson, not a book, not a conversion, but a boy in a dark arena leaning forward in his seat with the dust of an artificial prairie in the air, seized by an interest that would not let go of him for the next 76 years. What followed was the kind of obsession that only children are permitted, and that only a few children are lucky enough to be permitted by their parents. He read everything about the American Indian that a boy in New York could find, and when the boy's books ran out, he asked for more, and his father, a hosiery merchant with a practical mind and an unusual patience, arranged for his son to be given access to the adult collections at the American Museum of Natural History. So a small Irish Catholic boy from a comfortable family in Manhattan began spending his free hours in the great halls on the Upper West Side, among the totem poles that rose into the shadows of the ceiling, among the masks and the canoes and the cases of arrowheads, reading the reports of the Bureau of American Ethnology, while other boys his age were outside in the street. He read the myths of the plains and the northwest coast, the accounts of vision quests and buffalo dances, and the ceremonies by which a people made sense of the world they had been given. He read them not as curiosities, but as scripture, because he had no category yet for reading them any other way. And here is where the whole life turns, in a single quiet perception that occurred to him somewhere in those years and never afterward left him. On Sunday mornings, he knelt in a Catholic church and watched a priest in vestments raise bread and wine and speak words in a dead language over them. And a story was told there of a virgin birth, of a death, of a body that rose again, and a blood that could be drunk. In the museum on a Tuesday afternoon, he read of a man in a mask who danced the coming of the animals, of a hero who descended into the earth and returned changed, of a mother who gave birth to a god. The church told him that one of these was true, and the others were the errors of people who had not yet been shown the light. The boy, without deciding to rebel and without any wish to rebel, simply noticed that they were the same, not similar, the same shape, told in different accents, by different peoples, under different skies. That is the paradox that the whole of his life would be spent unfolding, and it is worth stating plainly before the story goes any further, because everything else grows from it. A devout Catholic boy, an altar server, a child who loved the incense and the Latin and the ritual gravity of the Mass, found his deepest religious feeling not in his own tradition, but in the traditions of everyone else. He lost the creed and kept the religion. He walked away from the exclusive claim of the church of his childhood, not because he ceased to believe in the sacred, but because he came to believe in it too widely to be contained. The very seriousness with which he had taken the Mass was what made him take the buffalo dance seriously. And the moment he took the buffalo dance seriously, the walls of the parish began quietly to come down. It is one of the strange mercies of his story that this did not leave him empty. Where another man might have found in that recognition only the collapse of everything he had been taught, Campbell found in it the outline of something larger, and he spent the rest of his years filling that outline in. The filling took a long time. He was not a prodigy who arrived early and was celebrated. He was a slow, wide, patient reader who spent decades in obscurity, and the shape of his life has almost nothing in common with the shape of a career. He went to Dartmouth and left it for Columbia, ran the half-mile fast enough to be one of the quickest men in the world at the distance for a season, took his degree in medieval literature, and won a fellowship that sent him to Paris in the last years of the 20s, where he read Arthurian romance in the mornings, and, in the evenings, encountered Joyce and Picasso, and the whole convulsion of modernism. He went on to Munich and learned Sanskrit and German, and opened, for the first time, the books of Freud and of Jung. He came home in the autumn of 1929, weeks before the market fell, with no doctorate, no employment, and a head full of Europe, into a country that had just stopped being able to promise anyone anything. And then, for 5 years, he did what almost no one does. He went to a rented shack near Woodstock in the Catskills, lived on almost nothing, and read 9 hours a day, divided into periods, year after year, without a supervisor, without an examination waiting at the end, without any assurance that it would ever amount to anything at all. He read the anthropologists and the historians and the philosophers, and the sacred books of the East. And slowly, in that silence, the thing he had glimpsed as a boy in the museum began to take a form he could describe, a pattern beneath the stories, a single narrative shape that seemed to lie under the myths of peoples who had never met, in ages that had never touched. When he finally emerged, it was into a classroom. He taught at Sarah Lawrence College for 38 years, married a dancer, edited the unfinished manuscripts of a dead friend, and in 1949 published a book about the pattern he had found, which he called The Hero's Journey. It sold modestly, and then it sold steadily, and then, across the decades, it began to be read by people the author had never imagined, by novelists and screenwriters and therapists and young men and women looking for a way to think about their own lives. He wrote 4 thick volumes on the mythologies of the world. He lectured for 20 years to whoever came, and at the very end, in his 80s, an old scholar living in Honolulu sat down in front of a camera with a journalist and spoke for hours about myth and meaning, in a voice so warm and so unguarded that when the conversations were broadcast, months after his death, millions of people who had never heard his name discovered that they had been waiting for him. Out of those conversations came 3 words that escaped into the language and are still there, worn smooth by repetition, frequently misunderstood, and far stranger and more demanding than they sound. Follow your bliss. The journey ahead moves through all of that, slowly, in the order in which he lived it. It begins in New Rochelle and in the Manhattan of his childhood, with the Catholic household and the ethnology reports, and an early loss that taught him, before he had any philosophy to explain it, that nothing built by human hands is permanent. It goes on to Europe, to Paris and Munich, where the certainties of the boy were dismantled by Joyce and Jung and Sanskrit grammar, and were not replaced with anything for a long while. It settles in the shack in the Catskills for the fallow years, the reading years, which look from outside like a young man wasting his 20s, and which were in fact the whole foundation of everything that came after. It follows him into the classroom at Sarah Lawrence, and into the long apprenticeship of editing another man's work, and then to the kitchen table where he wrote the book about the hero. From there, it opens outward into the 4 volumes of the Masks, into the great comparative survey of the world's mythologies, and the conferences in Switzerland, where he sat among the strangest and most learned company of his age. It pauses over the phrase itself, over what he actually meant by bliss, and what he certainly did not mean, since more nonsense has been built on those 3 words than on anything else he ever said. It travels with him through India and Japan in the mid-50s, where the ideas he had assembled from books met the places that had produced them and were altered by the meeting. It comes at last to the late fame, to the young filmmaker who read the hero book and made a space opera out of it, to the conversations before the camera, and to a quiet ending in Honolulu in the autumn of 1987, when a man who had spent his life among the stories of how human beings die and are reborn came to the end of his own. And then it returns, as these things do, to a boy of 7 in a dark hall, looking up at a totem pole that reached farther into the ceiling than he could see. He was born in New York City on the 26th of March, 1904, into a comfortable Irish Catholic household, of the kind the city produced in great numbers in those years. Families a generation or 2 removed from the crossing, settled now into business and respectability, and the parish. His father sold hosiery, dealt in the wholesale trade, moved among the buyers and salesmen of a city that was in those years remaking itself upward at a speed no one had ever seen. His mother kept the house and kept the faith, and the household observed the calendar of the church as naturally as it observed the weather. There was a younger brother, Charles, and later a sister, Alice. And in time the family left the city proper for New Rochelle, up the line in Westchester, where the streets were quieter and the lawns ran down toward the water, and a boy could get out of the house and stay out of it for whole afternoons. The Catholicism of that household was not the anguished, examined thing it became in certain novels of the century. It was ordinary and total. He was an altar boy. He learned the Latin responses by ear before he understood them, and he knelt in the incense and the candle smoke, while a man in vestments raised a piece of bread above his head and rang a bell. And something happened in the room when the bell rang, something that had nothing to do with wheat or with metal. He was taught, as every child in that church was taught, that this was the true thing, and that all the other ceremonies of the world, the ones performed in other buildings by men in other robes, were errors of one degree or another, honest confusions at best. He accepted this for a while, as children accept the shape of the world handed to them. And then something happened that made it impossible to go on accepting. What happened, in the simplest telling, was the totem poles. He had been taken to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and the show had done to him what it did to a great many boys of that generation, which was to fill his imagination with the plains and the horses and the feathered riders. But where most boys went home and played at it and forgot it by the following spring, This one went to the library, and then he went to the American Museum of Natural History on 79th Street and stood in the halls of the Northwest Coast Collection among the great carved cedar poles that rose past the balconies and into the dimness of the ceiling. And something in him fixed itself permanently on that dimness. He began reading everything the children's shelves held on the American Indian. And when he had exhausted them, he asked for more. And the librarians, faced with a small boy who would not go away, gave him what he wanted. Before long, he was reading the annual reports of the Bureau of American Ethnology, thick government volumes of field transcription and ritual description that were not written for children and were barely written for pleasure. And he read them the way other boys read adventure stories. In time, the museum let him into rooms the public did not enter, and he sat with the collections and the catalogues, a serious child among serious men who seemed to have decided that his seriousness earned him the courtesy. And in those pages, he found the thing that undid the arrangement he had been given. He found, in the ceremonial life of the plains and the pueblos and the coastal villages, the same gestures he knew from the parish church. He found the sacred meal. He found the initiate, who dies and is reborn. He found the animal that gives its body so that the people may live, and the ritual acknowledgement of that gift, and the mystery that hangs over the giving. He found the Virgin Mother, and the world-creating Word, and the return of the dead. He was not old enough to have a theory about any of this, and he did not attempt one. He simply saw, with the flat clarity of a child who has not yet learned which observations he is supposed to suppress, that the priest at the altar and the shaman at the fire were doing the same thing, and that, whatever the thing was, it did not belong to one people only. He did not stop being Catholic when he saw it. That is the part most easily missed. He went on serving at Mass, went on through the sacraments, went on for many years inside the practice. And what he had seen sat alongside the practice, rather than destroying it, the way a second language sits alongside a first. But the exclusive claim was gone, quietly and without drama, before he was 12 years old. And it never came back. He had two worlds by then, the world of the parish and the world of the museum. And he could not stop noticing that they rhymed. Then, in the spring of 1919, the house in New Rochelle burned. The fire took the family home and the family's possessions, and, in the confusion of it, the boy's grandmother, who did not get out. He was 15. Nothing in the records suggests he spoke of it often afterward, and it would be a distortion to make it the hinge of a life it does not appear to have hinged. But it belongs here, gently, because the child who had spent years reading about ceremonies designed to carry human beings across the fact of death had now met the fact itself, in his own house, on an ordinary night. Whatever else the great cycles of myth were, they were not decoration. They had been made by people who knew exactly what he had just learned, which is that the world one lives in is not permanent, that it can be taken in a night, and that the mind must be given some way of holding this that does not simply break under it. The family rebuilt. Life resumed, as it does, but the lesson had been delivered in the only way such lessons are ever really delivered, which is personally. He was sent to boarding school in Connecticut, to Canterbury, a Catholic school, and there he did what he had always done, which was to read enormously and to do well without appearing to strain. And he added to it a discovery that surprised everyone, including himself. He could run. He had the build for the middle distances, long-legged and light, and he found in the half-mile the peculiar satisfaction of an event that is neither a sprint nor an endurance test, but a sustained argument with one's own body, held at the edge of what the lungs will permit for 2 full minutes. He went up to Dartmouth in 1921, was unimpressed by the social life and the fraternity culture, and the general assumption that college was a pleasant interval rather than an education. And after a year, he transferred down to Columbia, back into the city, back within reach of the museum. Columbia suited him. He read English literature, and then medieval literature, and he found in the Arthurian romances a body of material that did to him what the ethnological reports had done a decade earlier, because here again were the same shapes in different clothing. The quest, the wasteland, the wounded king, the young fool who blunders into the sacred precinct and fails to ask the necessary question. He ran for Columbia and ran well enough that for a stretch in the mid-20s, he was among the fastest half-milers in the country. And there is a photograph somewhere in the mind's eye of that young man on the cinder track. And it is worth pausing on, because the discipline he was learning there was not separate from the discipline of the reading. Both were the same practice. A long, patient, unglamorous holding to a line, sustained past the point where the body or the attention wants to quit. He also played saxophone in a jazz band and made money at it during summers, and crossed the Atlantic twice as a musician on a steamship, which gave him the sea and gave him Europe before he had any scholarly reason to want either. By the time he took his bachelor's degree and stayed on for a master's in medieval literature, the shape of the intelligence was set. He was not a mystic, and he was not a skeptic. He was a comparatist by temperament, long before he had the word for it. A mind that could not read 2 stories side by side without noticing where they fell into the same pattern, and that had been trained by a Catholic boyhood to take rituals seriously, and by an ethnologist's library to take it universally. He had also learned something less easy to name, which was that the deepest thing in his own religion had not been the doctrine. It had been the moment when the bell rang and the ordinary room changed. Doctrine explained that moment, and different peoples explained it differently and fought over the explanations. But the moment itself was not an explanation and did not depend on one. It was simply what happened when human beings assembled themselves around a mystery. He did not yet know what to do with any of it. He had a master's degree in Arthurian romance, a talent for the half-mile, a passable saxophone, and a growing private conviction that the stories of the world's separated peoples were saying, in 1,000 accents, one thing. What he needed now was distance and better languages, and the company of minds larger than the ones available to him on Morningside Heights. A fellowship was coming that would give him all 3, and it would carry him to Paris in a year when Paris was inventing the century, and when he returned from it, he would be, for a while, entirely unemployable and entirely changed. The fellowship came in 1927, and it carried him across the Atlantic in the autumn of that year with a small allowance, a suitcase of books, and a research subject that had been chosen for him partly by his own enthusiasm and partly by the accidents of academic fashion. He was to study the Arthurian romances of the Middle Ages at the University of Paris, working with the philologists who had spent their careers tracing the migration of a story from Wales into Brittany, and from Brittany into the courts of France, watching a Celtic fragment turn into a chivalric epic, and then into a Christian allegory of the Grail. It was, on paper, a narrow errand. A young American would sit in the Bibliothèque Nationale and compare manuscripts, and would come home in due course with a dissertation on the transmission of a legend. That was the plan. And for a few months, he even followed it. And then Paris did to him what Paris was doing to nearly everyone who was young and awake in it during those particular years, which was to break the frame. He had arrived in a city that was inventing the century. Within walking distance of his rooms, painters were dismantling the human face and putting it back together with the pieces in a different order. In a small English-language bookshop on the Rue de l'Odéon, a woman named Sylvia Beach had, only 5 years earlier, published a novel that most of the English-speaking world regarded as either unreadable or indecent, and Campbell bought it and took it home, and could not make sense of a page of it. He had been trained to read for meaning, and Ulysses refused to yield meaning in the way he had been taught to extract it. He struggled with the book for weeks in a state of baffled irritation, and then, by his own later account, he did the only intelligent thing available to him, which was to stop trying to understand it and to let it happen to him instead. What he found on the other side of that surrender changed the shape of his mind permanently, although for what Joyce had done, he began to see, was to take a single ordinary day in a modern city, a day of advertisements and funerals and bad marriages and nothing much, and to lay it precisely over the wanderings of Odysseus, so that the two moved together like a hand inside a glove. The Dublin newspaperman was the hero returning. The barmaid was the siren. The eye of the one-eyed patriot in the pub was the eye of the Cyclops. And the point was not the cleverness of the correspondence. The point was that the correspondence was not invented. Joyce had not decorated a modern story with an ancient one. He had discovered that the ancient one was already there, underneath, structuring the modern one, whether anybody noticed or not. And that a man walking to a funeral in 1904 was walking a road that had been walked in Homer and would be walked again. The myth had not died when the gods were retired. It had simply gone underground and taken up residence in the ordinary. Campbell had come to Europe with a private suspicion that the world's stories rhymed. In Paris, he was handed the proof of it by a novelist rather than by a scholar, and he never quite forgot which of the two had gotten there first. He would say for the rest of his life that the artists were his real teachers, that the poets and the painters were doing the work of mythology in an age that had lost the vocabulary for it, and that a professor could describe the pattern, but only an artist could make it live again. The painters confirmed it. He looked at Picasso and found the human figure taken apart, the way a myth takes a man apart, before it puts him back together, transformed. He looked longer at Cézanne, and what he found there was quieter, and, for him, more important. Cézanne had painted the same mountain again and again, not to record its appearance, but to reach through the appearance to the structure beneath, the cone and the cylinder and the plane, the enduring form of which the mountain on any given afternoon was only a passing arrangement of light. That was precisely the operation Campbell wanted to perform on the stories of the world. Behind the 10,000 tales, in their 1,000 costumes, there was a shape. The tales were the mountain in the afternoon light. The shape was what the mountain was. He also encountered in Paris the death of his career as a conventional scholar, though it took him some time to notice the body. He had begun to ask his professors questions they were not interested in answering. He wanted to know why the Grail story, in the version he was reading, contained a wounded king and a wasteland, and why a wounded king and a wasteland appeared in the fertility myths of the ancient Near East, and whether the connection was historical transmission or something else. The philologists were courteous and unmoved. Transmission was their subject. The something else was not a subject at all. It belonged, if it belonged anywhere, to anthropology, or to speculation, or to a kind of thinking that respectable medieval studies had spent 50 years cleaning out of itself. He was being told, politely, that the only question he genuinely cared about was not a question. The fellowship was renewed for a second year, and he chose to spend it in Munich, which turned out to be the decisive move. He went there to learn Sanskrit and to improve his German. And he did both, sitting through the grammar with the same stubbornness he had once brought to the quarter mile, and beginning to read the Upanishads in a language closer to the one they were written in. But Munich, in 1928, also put into his hands two writers who had not been on any reading list at Columbia. He read Freud, and then he read Jung, and the ground moved. Freud gave him the dream. Here was a serious modern physician arguing, on clinical grounds, that the mind at night speaks in images and reversals and disguises, that it condenses and displaces, that it says one thing by showing another, which is to say that the mind at night speaks the language of myth, and had been speaking it in every human bedroom continuously, while the anthropologists were out collecting the daytime versions from strangers. Jung gave him something larger, and, to Campbell's temperament, more congenial. The suggestion that the imagery arising in dreams was not exhausted by a patient's private biography, that certain figures and situations recurred across patients who could not have inherited them from one another, and that these recurrences corresponded, often startlingly, to the motifs of mythologies the patients had never read. Whatever one made of the metaphysics, the observation was the observation Campbell had been making since he was a boy in a museum. The old thing and the new thing kept turning out to be the same thing. Somewhere in those 2 years, the Catholicism went. It did not go in a crisis, and he never described it as a wound. It simply became impossible for him to hold, in one hand, the belief that the story of the virgin birth and the dying and rising God was uniquely and historically true, when the other hand held a stack of virgin births and dying and rising gods, drawn from every continent and every era, most of them older. The claim to uniqueness was the part that failed. What did not fail, and this is the distinction that would organize the rest of his thinking, was the religious feeling itself, the sense that the bell rings and the ordinary room changes, that a human life is arranged around something it cannot name and can only gesture at. He kept the experience and let the exclusive doctrine go. And he came to regard the doctrine, ever afterward, as a local dialect mistaken by its speakers for the only language there is. He would put it later, with characteristic bluntness, that mythology is other people's religion, and religion is misunderstood mythology. He did not stop going to art museums with the reverence he had once brought to the altar rail. He simply stopped believing that only one altar had ever been real. There is a cost to this kind of expansion, and he paid it. He returned to New York in the autumn of 1929, in October of that year, arriving with 2 years of Sanskrit, an unfinished dissertation, a head full of Joyce and Jung and Cézanne, and no intention whatever of completing the narrow philological thesis that would have made him employable. He told Columbia that he wished to broaden the subject, to bring in the Sanskrit and the psychology and the comparative material, and Columbia, entirely predictably, declined. He was told to write the dissertation he had been funded to write, or to write nothing. He wrote nothing. He walked away from the doctorate and never took another degree as long as he lived. And the man who would eventually be read in 100 languages would remain, technically, a master's student who had not finished. The timing could hardly have been worse. Within weeks of his return, the market collapsed, and the country began its long slide into the Depression. And the modest teaching posts that a promising young medievalist might have expected simply ceased to exist. His father's business, like most businesses, contracted painfully. There was no money, no position, no institution, and no plausible next step. He had gone abroad as a promising graduate student on a fellowship and had come back as an unemployed young man with expensive intellectual habits and a conviction that could not be put on a curriculum vitae. And yet, what he had brought home was worth more than the credential he had refused. He had learned that the artists were the living myth makers, and that a modern novel could carry the same freight as an epic. He had learned that the dream and the myth were the same speech in two registers. He had learned that the pattern he had first sensed as a boy, comparing a mass to a buffalo dance, was visible to serious European minds and was not a schoolboy's fancy. He had, in short, found his question and had lost every institution that might have paid him to pursue it. There was nothing left to do but pursue it anyway, without salary, without supervision, and without any way of knowing whether it would take 5 years or the rest of his life. He would begin that autumn in a rented shack in the woods north of the city, with a stack of books and a great deal of time. The shack stood near Woodstock, in the wooded country of the Catskills, where a loose community of artists and writers had settled because rent was cheap, and nobody asked what a person did for a living. It was not much of a house. It had a stove, a table, a bed and windows that let in the cold, and the arrangement suited him precisely because it demanded almost nothing of him. He had calculated that he could live on a very small sum indeed if he wanted nothing but food, firewood, and books. And it turned out that he wanted nothing else. The years that followed, from the autumn of 1929 to the autumn of 1934, would later be described by him without embarrassment as the best 5 years of his education, and he meant that literally more was accomplished in that shack than in Dartmouth, Columbia, Paris, and Munich combined. He built a schedule and kept it with the discipline he had learned as a runner. He divided the day into 4 periods of 4 hours each, and in 3 of those 4 periods he read, keeping 1 free for whatever the body and the weather required. 9 hours of sheer reading a day, as he later put it, and he did it for 5 years without an examination to pass, a thesis to defend, or a supervisor to satisfy. There is a particular quality to reading done that way. Reading for a degree is reading with one eye on the door. A man is always measuring what he takes in against what he will be asked to produce. Reading with no door at all is a different act. It becomes conversation. The books begin to talk to one another across the centuries and across the table, and the reader, sitting between them, becomes less a student than a host. What he read in those years determined everything he would afterward write. He read Oswald Spengler, whose vast and gloomy account of civilizations rising and setting like organisms gave him the idea that a culture has a lifespan and a morphology, that it is born, matures, hardens and dies, and that its art and its religion are the changing expressions of a single interior form. He read Leo Frobenius, the German ethnologist who had walked across Africa collecting stories, and who insisted that a culture's mythology was not an accidental collection of tales, but the shape of its soul made visible. From Frobenius, he took the notion of the paiduma, the formative genius of a people, and the confidence that mythologies could be compared as one compares skeletons, structure to structure, without insulting the flesh of either. He read Carl Jung, and Jung, more than anyone, gave him the vocabulary he had been groping toward since boyhood. The archetype, the collective unconscious, the idea that beneath the personal history of any dreamer runs a deeper layer of image and pattern common to the species. Here at last was a theory that could account for why a Pueblo emergent story and a Greek descent to the underworld should feel, to an attentive reader, like the same story told in different weather. He read Freud too, and kept a lasting respect for him, though he found Freud's insistence on reducing every image to the family drama too narrow a room to live in. Jung's larger house, with its many windows, was the one he moved into. He read Nietzsche, and Nietzsche gave him something no ethnologist could: a temperament, the insistence that the individual must create values rather than inherit them, the courage of the man who had lost his God and refused to be consoled about it, the celebration of what Nietzsche called the yes-saying spirit. All of this suited a young man who had walked away from his church without walking away from the sacred. He read Schopenhauer, whose grave and beautiful pessimism about the will, and whose essay on the apparent design in the fate of the individual, stayed with him permanently. Decades later, he would still be quoting Schopenhauer's observation that when a person looks back on a life, it takes on the appearance of a composed novel, arranged by an author the person did not know he had. And he read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and Buddhist sutras in whatever translations he could find, and discovered in them a metaphysics that made the Christian imagery of his childhood suddenly legible, not as history to be believed, but as a set of figures pointing at something that could not be said outright. It is worth pausing over what that kind of solitude does to a mind, because it is the least fashionable part of his story, and possibly the most important. Every tradition he was reading knew about it. The desert fathers of Egypt went out into the sand because they had understood that a certain kind of clarity does not arrive in company. The Buddha sat under his tree alone. Thoreau went to Walden for 2 years and 2 months to front the essential facts and to see whether he could learn what they had to teach. Something in the deep grammar of the spiritual life requires a fallow period, a stretch of years in which nothing is produced, nothing is published, nothing is proven to anyone, and the ground is simply left alone to gather what it needs. The economy has never known what to do with such a period. It looks from the outside exactly like failure, and it is often indistinguishable from failure while it is happening, since the man in the shack has no more evidence than the idler does that anything is occurring. He is unemployed. He is 30. His contemporaries are advancing. The only difference between the two is that one of them is being watered by something, and neither can see it. Campbell was fortunate in one respect. The Depression had made his poverty ordinary. Nobody in America in 1931 was surprised to hear that a young man had no job, and the general collapse of respectable prospects gave him a strange freedom, since there was no ladder to fall off. He chopped wood and hauled water. He walked in the hills. He kept up his running for a while, out of habit, and he played in a jazz band on occasion for a little money, which pleased him. And he read. In the middle of those years, he interrupted them, in the way that a life will insist on interrupting even the most perfect scheme, and drove across the country. In 1932, he went to California, and in Carmel and Monterey, he fell in with a company that would sharpen everything the books had been teaching him. There was John Steinbeck, not yet famous, and Steinbeck's wife, Carol. And above all, there was Ed Ricketts, the marine biologist whose laboratory on Cannery Row was the least laboratory-like place imaginable, being also a salon, a music room, and a permanent open house. Ricketts collected the animals of the tide pools and sold them to schools, and he thought about them in a way that no textbook thought about them. Campbell went north with Ricketts on a collecting voyage up the coast to Alaska, and spent long hours crouched over the intertidal rocks in the grey light, taking down specimens and listening. What Ricketts saw in a tide pool was not a list of creatures, but a community, a whole in which each organism was a function of the others and of the tides, so that no animal could be understood alone. Ricketts had a phrase for the way of seeing he preferred, which he called breaking through, the moment when a person stops looking at the parts and perceives the pattern that holds them. It was, in a marine biologist's language, precisely what Campbell had been reading in Jung and Frobenius and the Upanishads. The organism belongs to the pool. The image belongs to the psyche. The individual myth belongs to a system larger than the people who tell it. And it is that system, not the isolated story, that carries the meaning. He came back east from that voyage with the last piece in place, and with something more delicate as well, which was the beginning of a certainty. There is a difference between believing a thing and having seen it. And somewhere between the 9th hour of reading on a winter afternoon and the cold rocks at low tide, he had crossed from one to the other. The mythologies of the world were not a museum of curiosities, each locked in its own case. They were variations on a small number of themes, and the themes were not arbitrary, because they arose from the shape of a human life. Being born, being separated from the mother, being tested, marrying, aging, facing the fact of death, which is everywhere the same shape, however differently it is furnished. The stories differed, because the deserts and the forests and the histories differed. The structure held. By 1934, he had the outline of the thought that would occupy the next 50 years, and he had almost nothing else. He had no degree beyond his master's, no publications, no institutional standing, and no income. He had a trunk of notebooks, a habit of 9 hours a day, and a growing impatience, because a pattern seen and never spoken begins after a while to press against the ribs. A man can read alone indefinitely, but the thing he has found in the reading wants an ear. It wants a room with other people in it, and questions from the back, and the resistance of another mind, without which even the truest idea slowly turns into a private religion. So when the letter came that year, offering him a position teaching literature at a small women's college in Bronxville, he did not hesitate for long over the modest salary or the obscurity of the post. The shack had done what shacks do. It had given him the whole library of the world and the silence in which to hear it, and it had nothing further to offer him. except more of the same. What he needed now was not more books, but the sound of his own voice, discovering what it thought, in front of people young enough to ask why it mattered. He packed the notebooks, closed the stove, and went down out of the hills to become, for the next 38 years, a teacher. The college he came to in the autumn of 1934 was only 8 years old, and still had about it the atmosphere of an experiment that had not yet decided whether it would succeed. Sarah Lawrence stood on a hillside in Bronxville, a suburb of stone houses and hedges just north of the city, and it had been founded on the conviction that education was not the transfer of a syllabus from one head into another, but the slow drawing out of what a particular student was actually capable of caring about. There were no fixed courses of the ordinary kind, and no examinations in the ordinary sense. Instead, each student met her teacher alone, week by week, in what the college called conference. And in that hour, the work was not lectured at her, but built with her, out of what she had read, and what she had failed to understand, and what had unexpectedly moved her. For a man who had spent 5 years in a shack, teaching himself by conversation with dead authors, it was very nearly the ideal arrangement. He had been trained by solitude in exactly the skill the place required, which was the ability to take a single mind seriously for an hour at a time. He was 30 years old, tall, athletic still, with the unhurried courtesy of a man who has spent a long time listening to books and is therefore in no rush to interrupt anybody. He had been hired to teach literature, and literature is what he taught for 38 years, not comparative mythology, which was not yet a subject anyone could major in, but novels and poems and plays, the ordinary furniture of an English department, approached in a wholly unordinary way. He did not ask his students what a work meant. He thought the question of meaning, put in that flat interrogative form, was the surest way to kill a book, because it invited the student to produce a sentence about the text, and then to set the text aside, having extracted its lesson like a stone from a fruit. What he asked instead was what the book had done, what had happened in the reader while the reading was going on. Where had the attention quickened? Where had it gone cold? What had the images stirred up from below? This was not a trick of pedagogy. It followed directly from everything the years of reading had shown him. If myth was the collective dream of a people, then a poem or a novel was a dream in the same language, and one does not interpret a dream by summarizing it. One re-enters it. So he insisted that his students read the whole book, all of it, from the first page to the last, without the anthologized excerpt or the helpful introduction. And he was fond of saying that a work of art is not an argument to be won, but an experience to be had. The students who came to him, half prepared to be told the right answers, discovered that there were no right answers on offer. Only a man who seemed genuinely curious about what had happened to them in the reading, and who would then, almost casually, mention that something very like it had happened to a Navajo initiate, or a medieval knight, or a Hindu ascetic 3,000 years before. That was the whole method. He never announced the pattern. He let it appear in the corner of the eye, again and again, until the student saw it herself and could not thereafter unsee it. He was, by every surviving account, extraordinarily good at this. Generations of women left that hillside, remembering not a doctrine, but a quality of attention, the sense of having been read as carefully as any of the books, and the teaching did for him what he had hoped it would when he came down out of the hills. It forced the thought into speech Ideas that had lain in the notebooks as private shorthand had now to be made sayable to a 19-year-old who had never heard of Frobenius and had no particular reason to care. Anything that could not survive that translation was probably not yet understood. He spent nearly 4 decades in the finest laboratory a scholar could ask for, testing the pattern daily against the resistance of intelligent people who owed him nothing. And the prose he eventually wrote, plain, warm, spoken rather than written, was formed in those conference hours, long before it was ever set on paper. In 1938, he married one of them. Jean Erdmann had been his student, a young woman from Honolulu with a Hawaiian and New England ancestry, and a body already trained toward dance. And after her graduation, they were married in May of that year, and remained married for the rest of his life. 49 years. She joined the Martha Graham Company almost immediately and spent the following years on tour, building a career as a dancer and then as a choreographer of unusual independence, eventually leaving Graham to make her own work and to found her own theatre. It was not a conventional arrangement for its decade. She travelled, he taught and wrote. The apartment they kept in Greenwich Village on Waverley Place, filled with books on one side, and with the practical debris of the studio on the other. What she gave him, beyond companionship, was a lifelong argument in the flesh for something he already suspected. That myth is not finally a matter of ideas at all, but of the body in motion, of gesture and rhythm and rite, and that the dancer knows in the muscle what the scholar can only diagram. He watched her rehearse for half a century. It kept his subject from ever becoming merely literary. Then, in the early years of the war, a man arrived in New York who changed the direction of his working life. Heinrich Zimmer was a German Indologist of enormous learning and enormous charm, who had lost his university chair in Heidelberg because his wife was Jewish, and who had made his way, by way of England, to a lectureship at Columbia. Campbell went to hear him, and was, in the way of a man meeting his own future, immediately captured. Here was someone who read the Indian material, not as a philologist counting variants, but as a living body of imagery, still capable of speaking, and who had the storyteller's gift for making a Sanskrit tale open like a door. The two became friends. Campbell attended his lectures and took full notes, as much out of pleasure as out of purpose. Zimmer died suddenly of pneumonia in the spring of 1943, at 52, only a few years after arriving in the country, leaving behind a great mass of unfinished work, lecture notes, drafts, fragments in 3 languages, whole books existing only as sequences of gestures toward a book. His widow asked Campbell to see what could be made of them. He said yes, and then spent the next 12 years doing it. Out of that wreckage, he assembled 4 volumes. The Study of Indian Art and Civilization, the book of tales he called The King and the Corpse, the long survey of the philosophies of India, and finally, the vast illustrated work on the art of Indian Asia. It was an act of extraordinary devotion, and from a certain angle, of extraordinary self-postponement. A man of 39, with his own book pressing against his ribs, sat down instead to complete another man's, and did it so faithfully that scholars still argue about where Zimmer ends and Campbell begins. He never regretted it. The years inside Zimmer's mind gave him the whole depth of the Indian tradition in a way no amount of solitary reading would have. And they gave him something else besides, a sentence he would repeat for the rest of his life, and always a tribute to his friend. The best things Zimmer had liked to say cannot be told. The second best are misunderstood. That formula, the mystery itself silent, the myth its imperfect and inevitably mistaken translation, became the quiet flaw beneath everything Campbell afterwards wrote about religion. It explained why the great teachings so consistently curdle into dogma, and why the images must be renewed. It also, in a gentler way, explained his own eventual style, which was always more suggestion than assertion. A man pointing rather than defining. In the same crowded years, he took on another dead language labour. This one comic. Since Paris, he had carried James Joyce with him, and Finnegan's Wake had appeared in 1939 to a general bewilderment that struck him as unnecessary. He thought he could see what Joyce was doing, because he had been reading the same materials Joyce had been reading, the cyclical histories, the fairy tales, the whole polyglot rubble of world mythology poured into one Dublin night. With Henry Morton Robinson, a writer and editor he had come to know, he began to work through the book line by line, unpacking the puns, tracing the buried names, following the dreamer down through his layers. The result, a skeleton key to Finnegan's Wake, appeared in 1944, the first sustained guide to the most famously impenetrable novel of the century, and it made his name among a small and passionate readership. More importantly, it confirmed for him the equation he had been circling since Woodstock. Joyce had not written a puzzle, he had written a dream, and had built it, deliberately, out of the same figures that appear in the dreams of tribes. If the modern artist and the archaic shaman were drawing from the same well, then the pattern was not a museum piece. It was still operating, still generating, in a book published in his own lifetime by a nearly blind Irishman in Paris. By the mid-40s then, he was 40 years old and had produced, with astonishing labour, a commentary on Grimm, a key to Joyce, and the beginnings of another man's collected works. Every one of these was a service to somebody else's text. He had spent his life so far as an apprentice in other people's books, and had done it with such generosity that he might easily have gone on doing it until he was old. But the pattern he had first glimpsed in a shack in the hills was by now fully visible to him, assembled out of 1,000 stories, and tested for a decade against a roomful of young faces, and it belonged to nobody else. In the evenings, at the kitchen table on Waverley Place, he had begun to write it down. The book took shape slowly, in the hours that teaching left him, which were the early mornings, and the long evenings, and the summers, when the college emptied, and Greenwich Village turned quiet and hot. He wrote at the kitchen table, in the apartment on Waverley Place, with the accumulated notes of 15 years stacked around him in the manila folders he had been filling since Woodstock. And he wrote by a method that was less composition than assembly. He had been gathering stories the way a naturalist gathers specimens, and the gathering had gone on so long that the arrangement had almost made itself. What remained was to find the sentence that would hold them, and then the next sentence, and then the paragraph that would carry a reader from a Blackfoot legend to a passage in the Odyssey, without any sense of having crossed a border. It took him the better part of 5 years. When it appeared in 1949, under the imprint of the Bollingen Foundation, it was called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and it was the first book with his name alone upon the cover. The thesis of it can be stated in a breath, though the stating of it flattens what the book actually does. Beneath the enormous variety of the world's stories about extraordinary persons, Campbell argued, there runs a single narrative shape, so consistent across cultures that have never touched one another, that it cannot be explained by borrowing or migration, and must therefore arise from something common in the people telling it. He gave this shape a name he took from Finnegan's Wake, where Joyce had coined it and let it lie, the monomyth, and he set it out in one long sentence in the opening pages, a sentence that has probably been quoted more often than anything else he wrote. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day, he wrote, into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons upon his fellow man. Departure, initiation, return. 3 movements, like the movements of a symphony, and each of them subdividing into stages that he traced through Buddhist scripture, an Irish folktale, and Polynesian voyage song, and the dreams recorded by clinicians in Vienna and Zurich. But it is worth pausing on what he meant by that shape, because to describe it as a formula is to misunderstand what he thought he had found. He did not believe that storytellers were following a template. He believed that the template was following them, that the story arose again and again because it was the shape of a particular kind of human experience, the experience of being changed, and that any culture in which people are changed will eventually produce the story of it. It begins with the call. Something disturbs the ordinary arrangement of a life. A herald appears. A stag runs past. A letter arrives. A frog speaks from the bottom of a well. A voice comes out of a burning bush on the far side of the desert. The disturbance is almost always small, and almost always arrives from a direction the person was not watching. Campbell was careful about this. The call does not announce itself as destiny. It announces itself as an interruption, and often as an unwelcome one, which is why the second stage of the story is so often the refusal. The refusal of the call fascinated him more than any other stage, and he wrote about it with a tenderness that suggests he knew it from the inside. The person hears the summons and declines it. He has obligation, she has a household, the timing is wrong, the risk is absurd. Refusal of the summons, he wrote, converts the adventure into its negative. And the negative he described is not punishment but stagnation, a life that keeps its walls and loses its air. He found the pattern everywhere. He found it in the young man who came to Jesus and went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. He found it in Daphne, fleeing into bark and leaf, rather than face the God who pursued her. He found it, one suspects, in the faces of certain of his own students, and in the version of himself who might have stayed safely in New Rochelle and sold hosiery. Those who do not refuse pass over a threshold, and here the geography of the story changes. The known world ends. The guardians of the boundary are met and passed, and the hero enters what Campbell called the belly of the whale, borrowing the image from Jonah, but finding it in 100 other places. The swallowing, the descent, the disappearance into darkness. This is the stage at which the person who set out is annihilated, not physically, in most tellings, but as a self. The old identity, the one that had a name and a position and a set of certainties, does not survive the passage. It is digested. What emerges on the other side is something the story has to describe with new words. Then the road of trials, which is the long middle of every such story, and the reason the middle of every such story feels long. A series of ordeals, each harder than the last, each testing a different capacity, none of them final. Campbell noticed that these trials are rarely solved by force. They are solved by attention, by courtesy to some overlooked creature, by the remembering of an instruction given earlier by someone who seemed unimportant. The hero survives by having listened, and in the depths of the road there occur the two great encounters, which he treated as the mythological heart of the whole structure. There is the meeting with the goddess, the figure of the world in its wholeness, mother and lover and destroyer at once. The encounter in which the seeker discovers that what he took to be an enemy and what he took to be a beloved are aspects of a single face. And there is the atonement with the Father, which he was careful to hear as at one moment a reconciliation with the principle of authority itself, with whatever it is in the universe that says no, that limits and judges and eventually kills. To be at one with that, he wrote, is to have gotten past the dread of it. The Father is not defeated in these stories. He is understood, and in being understood, he ceases to be a tyrant and becomes simply the way things are. What lies past those meetings is the boon, the elixir, the fire, the golden fleece, the herb of immortality, the tablets of the law, the illumination under the tree. And it is precisely here that Campbell said something the rest of the tradition had tended to skip over. The finding of the treasure is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the harder half. The return is more difficult than the departure, and the stories know it. The hero who has been transformed must come back to a village that has not been, carrying something the village has no vocabulary for, and must find a way to translate it that does not destroy it. Sometimes the return is refused outright. The seeker stays in the paradise he found, and the tale ends there, incomplete. Sometimes he comes back and is not believed, or is believed and destroyed for it. Sometimes, in the versions Campbell loved best, the returning figure achieves what he called the freedom to live, the capacity to move between the two worlds without belonging entirely to either, to hold the vision and still buy the groceries. He was insistent that all of this was a description of an inner event. The dragon is not in Wales. The threshold is not on any map. When he wrote that the latest incarnation of Oedipus and the continued romance of Beauty and the Beast stand this afternoon on the corner of 42nd Street and 5th Avenue, he meant it flatly, without metaphor. The pattern is not a relic of a credulous age. It is the shape of what happens to a person who leaves home, or marries, or loses a parent, or changes their life at 40, or dies. Every such passage is a departure, an ordeal in the dark, and a return with something in the hands. Mythology, in this reading, is not a set of false statements about the world. It is a set of accurate statements about the interior of a human life, phrased in the only language capacious enough to carry them. And there was a consolation in it that he offered almost in passing, though it may be the reason the book has outlived its scholarship. We have not even to risk the adventure alone, he wrote, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. What he was proposing was not merely that a pattern exists, but that the pattern is company, that the frightening thing one is going through has been gone through and recorded and survived by an unbroken line of people stretching back past writing, and that their stories are less like entertainment than like maps left in a cave by the previous party. The book sold slowly. It was published by a small foundation, priced beyond most readers, and reviewed politely and thinly. Academic mythologists found it too sweeping. The general public, in 1949, was not looking for a comparative study of initiation rites. For most of a decade, it moved a few hundred copies a year. Campbell went on teaching at Sarah Lawrence, went on taking the train up to Bronxville, went on saying much the same things to 19-year-olds in a seminar room. He was 45 when it appeared, and he would be past 70 before the world caught up to it, before a generation of readers who had grown up without any inherited mythology at all discovered that somebody had written down the shape of the thing they were missing. The book he had assembled at a kitchen table would wait, patient as a seed, through the whole of his middle age. He did not wait with it. Even as the first copies went out, he was already turning toward a far larger undertaking. Not the shape of a single story now, but the whole history of the human imagination, told across the continents and the millennia, in all the disguises it had ever worn. The work that followed took him 20 years, and it began, as most of his work did, in the ordinary rhythm of a teaching life. The commute, the seminar, the summer months cleared for writing, the desk in the apartment on Waverley Place, with its view of a Greenwich Village street. He had set himself the task of surveying the entire mythological inheritance of the species, what people had believed and enacted and dreamed, from the hunting societies of the Paleolithic to the poets of the 20th century. Arranged not as a museum catalogue of curiosities, but as a single continuous literature written by one author under many names. He called the result The Masks of God, and it appeared in 4 volumes between 1959 and 1968, beginning with the primitive world, moving east into India, China and Japan, west into the Levant and Europe, and arriving at last in the modern age, where the masks had all come off, and nobody quite knew what to do about it. The title carried the whole argument in 3 words. A mask is worn. A mask is not the face. The gods of the world, in Campbell's reading, were not competing claims about what exists, but successive costumes assumed by an energy that has no proper shape of its own, and which becomes visible only when it puts on a local form. A bull, a mother, a crucified man, a wheel of law. To ask which mask was the true one was to misunderstand what a mask is for. He was fond of saying that mythology is psychology, misread as biography and history and cosmology, which sounds like a demotion of religion and was intended as the opposite. The myths were not failed science. They were accurate reports about the interior of a human life, written in the only language that interior speaks, which is image. The first volume, the primitive one, sent him back to the material that had held him since boyhood, and it gave him a distinction he would use for the rest of his life. In the hunting cultures of the far north and the Americas, he found the figure of the shaman, the individual who has undergone a crisis, often in adolescence, often alone, and who has come back from it with a personal vision and the authority that vision confers. Nobody appointed him. He was seized. His power rested on nothing but the fact of his own experience, and the community trusted him because they could see what had happened to him. Against this, Campbell set the figure of the priest, who belongs to the agricultural societies of the great river valleys, and whose authority is of an entirely different kind. The priest has been ordained. He administers a rite he did not invent, on behalf of a community whose calendar depends on it, and his personal inner life is beside the point. He is a functionary of a system that would run just as well without his private illuminations. Campbell did not use the contrast to declare one of them better, though anyone who listened to him for long could guess where his sympathies lay. He used it to explain a rhythm that runs through the whole history of religion. The tension between the vision that arrives to a single person in the wilderness and the institution that grows up to preserve it, protect it, distribute it, and eventually to forget what it was. Every priesthood, he liked to point out, was founded by a shaman. Every settled rite began as somebody's astonishment, and the long decline of a tradition is nothing more mysterious than the slow drift by which the astonishment becomes an obligation, and the mask, which was once alive on a dancing body, is nailed to a wall and revered as a face. He was not doing this thinking in isolation. Since the mid-1950s, he had been traveling most summers to a garden on the shore of Lake Maggiore, in the Swiss village of Ascona, where a woman named Olga Frobe-Kaptin had established an annual gathering called the Eranos Conferences. There, for a few weeks each year, an unlikely assembly of scholars sat under the trees and gave one another long lectures with no examinations at the end of them. Carl Jung himself in the early years, the classicist Carl Karenyi, the historian of religions Mircea Eliade, the Japanese scholar Daisetsu Suzuki, who had brought Zen into English, and a scattering of physicists, Indologists and art historians who had all arrived at the same suspicion from different directions. Campbell found in that garden the thing he had never quite had at Sarah Lawrence, which was a room full of people who took the material as seriously as he did. He also found a publishing home, the Bollingen Foundation, funded by Paul and Mary Mellon, and named for Jung's stone tower, which had brought out the hero with 1,000 faces, and which now undertook to translate the Eranos papers, and to underwrite the enormous labour of comparison that the 4 volumes required. It was in these years that his account of what myth is actually for reached its final form, and he would repeat it with small variations for the next quarter century. A living mythology, he came to think, does 4 things at once, and a mythology dies when it stops doing them. It opens a person to the sheer mystery of being here at all, the awe that precedes any question, the sense that existence is not an ordinary fact. It gives an image of the universe consistent with what that culture actually knows about the world, so that the shape of the cosmos and the shape of the story are the same shape. It validates and supports a particular social order, telling the members of a community who they are and what they owe one another. And it carries the individual through the difficult passages of a single lifetime: birth, adolescence, marriage, failure, age, and the end, in such a way that each passage is not merely endured, but understood as a stage in something that has a form. The mystical function, the cosmological, the sociological, the pedagogical. He spoke of them as 4 services rendered by one thing, and he was quite clear that the modern crisis was not the loss of all 4, but the collapse of the middle 2, while the outer 2 went on being needed as much as ever. Our picture of the universe had changed beyond recognition. Our social order had become plural, mobile and unrepeating. But the mystery had not diminished, and children still grew up, and people still died. Somewhere in these decades, he also worked out, quietly and without polemic, exactly where he stood in relation to the 2 men whose work had first cracked the world open for him in Munich. From Freud, he took the great insight that the images of dream and the images of myth are made of the same material, and that neither is arbitrary. But he could not follow Freud in reading every symbol backwards into the nursery, resolving the cathedral into an unresolved quarrel with one's parents. That, to Campbell, was to mistake the doorway for the room. Freud, he thought, had discovered the pathology of the symbol and had generalized it into a theory of the healthy, so that the whole imaginative achievement of the species came out looking like a symptom. With Jung, the parting was subtler and more affectionate, and he never made much noise about it. Jung had given him the vocabulary he used all his life, the archetype, the collective layer beneath the personal, the idea that the psyche produces the same figures in people who have never met. But Jung was a doctor, and his interest in a myth was finally its use in the healing of a particular patient in a consulting room in Küsnacht. Campbell was a reader, and his interest was in the story itself, in its shape as a work of art, in what happens to a person who takes it in whole rather than takes it apart. He was also more cautious than Jung about the metaphysics, where Jung was drawn toward the claim that the archetypes are objectively there, structures of the world as much as of the mind. Campbell tended to leave the question suspended, saying only that this is how the imagination behaves, and that the behavior is universal. He was, in the end, less a psychologist than a comparatist with a literary conscience, and he trusted the poem more than he trusted the diagnosis, all of which was preparation for the fourth volume, the one that mattered most to him and which he wrote last. He called it Creative Mythology, and it broke the pattern of the other three, because it was not a survey of a region or an era, but an account of what happens when the shared story fails, beginning with the 12th century romances of the Grail, with Tristan and Isolde choosing a love that no church would bless, moving forward through Dante and Blake and Wagner and Nietzsche to Joyce and Mann and the modern novel. He traced the emergence of a wholly new kind of myth-making, one that no longer descends from authority, from the temple or the tribe, but rises from the experience of a single adequate individual who has had and has trusted an authentic realization of his own. That person then finds the images for it. That person becomes, in a culture with no priesthood he can honestly join, his own shaman. It was, in one sense, an elegy. The old masks no longer fit. The collective mythology that could carry a whole society had come apart, and there was no restoring it by nostalgia or decree. But Campbell did not write it as a lament, because the situation seemed to him not a catastrophe so much as an assignment. The modern person had been handed the burden and the freedom that had once belonged only to the visionary at the edge of the camp, to go inward without a map, to find the images that were true to a particular life, and to live by them without any institution standing behind to confirm the reading. It was a heavy inheritance, and it left him with an obvious next question: how a person actually does that, alone, in an ordinary life, with no wilderness to walk into, and no elders waiting to interpret the vision on the way back. He had been circling the answer for years, and it would come down, in the end, to a single word he had found in Sanskrit. The word was Ananda, and he had carried it with him since the Munich years, though it took decades before he understood what he wanted to do with it. In the Sanskrit tradition, the ground of being, the transcendent that could not be named or described or approached by argument, was sometimes rendered by three terms held together in one breath: Sat, Chit, Ananda, being a consciousness, and rapture. The three were understood not as attributes possessed by something else, but as the thing itself, seen from three sides. And the point of the formula was that a person who found any one of them had found all three, since at that depth they were not separable. Campbell liked to explain, in his later lectures, why he had settled on the third of the three, rather than the first or the second. He could not be certain, he said, that what he took for his own being was really his being, or that what he called his consciousness was proper consciousness. Those were metaphysical claims, and he was not in the business of making them. But he did know where his rapture was, and he could follow that with confidence, because it was the one term of the three he could actually locate in his own experience without theorizing. If rapture was one of the doors into the ground of being, and it was the only door whose handle he could feel in the dark, then he would take it. That was the whole of the reasoning. And it was, characteristically, less a mystical claim than a practical one. What he meant by rapture was not pleasure, and this was the misunderstanding that dogged the phrase for the rest of his life, and long after it. Pleasure is a response to what is agreeable, and it recedes as soon as the agreeable thing is removed. Bliss, in the sense he intended, was a kind of recognition. It was the peculiar quickening a person feels in the presence of the thing they are for, the deepening of attention that comes when the whole self is engaged rather than a fraction of it, and it had nothing to do with comfort. He was quite explicit that the pursuit of it would cost. The bliss was not the reward at the end of the road. It was the road, and the road went through country a person would not have chosen. He described it most often as a track already laid down. A person following their bliss, he said, puts himself on a kind of track that has been there all the while, waiting, and begins to live the life he ought to have been living. The image is worth pausing over, because it contains his whole disagreement with the idea that a life is something a person designs and then executes. In his reading, the shape was already implicit, the way an oak is implicit in an acorn, and the work was not invention but discovery, a matter of attending closely enough to notice which of the many possible directions produced that quickening, and which produced only the dutiful hum of a task performed correctly. The doors, he liked to add, would open where there had been no doors before, and would open for him and for nobody else. He spoke sometimes of invisible hands, of a sense that once a person commits fully to the track, help arrives from directions that could not have been predicted or arranged. He never claimed to know what the hands were. He only observed, from a long life of watching students and friends and himself, that people who committed wholly tended to find assistance, and people who hedged tended to find none, and that the difference was too consistent to be ignored. His own 5 years in the shack outside Woodstock were, in retrospect, the demonstration. He had no income worth mentioning, no institutional standing, no degree completed, and no evidence at all that reading 9 hours a day would ever amount to anything a society would pay for. He simply could not stop, and the not stopping turned out to be the trail. He was fond of saying that he had never in his life felt he had a job, only that he had followed what fascinated him, and found, to his own surprise, that a career had assembled itself behind him. That was the argument he was making when he told the young to follow their bliss. Not that the world rewards enthusiasm, but that a person who spends 30 years on the wrong track has spent 30 years, and that the calculation is not as prudent as it looks. He grew tired, in his last decade, of hearing the phrase repeated back to him in a form he did not recognize. It had escaped into the general air by then, printed on posters and quoted in commencement addresses, and it had acquired a soft, permissive meaning that he had never intended. Do what feels nice, Follow the impulse. Decline whatever is difficult. The version that came back to him was hedonism with a Sanskrit pedigree, and it left out everything that had made the idea serious. There is a story, often repeated by his students, that late in life, he remarked that he should have said, "Follow your blisters instead," since the blisters are the more reliable indicator of where a person has been walking in earnest. Whether he said it exactly so is uncertain, but the sentiment is unmistakably his. He had spent his life reading myths in which the hero is stripped, tested, swallowed and dismembered before anything is given. And it was not plausible that he meant, at the end of all that reading, that a person should simply do as he pleases. The distinction he kept trying to draw was between what a person wants and what a person is for. And it is a distinction the modern arrangement of work makes unusually hard to see. He watched it in his students at Sarah Lawrence for nearly 4 decades. Young women arriving with a clear and often quite genuine talent, who were nonetheless being steered by families and by the general common sense of the era toward the safer profession, the more legible credential, the position that could be explained at a dinner table without embarrassment. He had a great tenderness for them and very little patience for the advice they were being given. A career, in the sense the word had acquired, was a ladder, and the whole logic of a ladder is that a person climbs it without ever asking what it is leaning against. He would say, more or less, that it is a terrible thing to spend a life climbing well and arrive at the top to discover that the wall was the wrong one, and that the discovery, when it comes, tends to come at an age when descending is a great deal harder than it once was. Yet he was not calling for recklessness, and he had no interest in the romantic idea that a person proves his sincerity by ruining himself. What he was describing was closer to obedience than to liberty. The bliss was not a preference to be indulged. It was a summons to be answered, and it arrived with obligations that a preference never carries. Once a person knows where the track lies, walking it is no longer optional in any meaningful sense, because to refuse it is to spend the rest of a life in the company of the refusal. This is what he had meant in the earlier book by the refusal of the call, the person who declines to go, and who then finds that the world has quietly become a wasteland, not because anything external has changed, but because the one thing that would have organized it has been declined. And there was always the dragon. He returned to that figure again and again in these years, because it stated the cost more honestly than any argument could. In the European myths, the treasure lies in a cave, and the cave is occupied by a serpent that has gathered all the gold and all the maidens of the kingdom into a heap beneath its belly, and can use none of it, having no capacity for gold and no capacity for love, only the capacity to hoard. That, he said, is the psychology of the person who has accumulated everything the culture told him to accumulate and cannot spend a moment of it on anything he actually wants. The dragon is not out in the world. It is the sum of the shoulds a person has swallowed since childhood, and it lies directly across the entrance to whatever the treasure is, which is why the entrance is so unappealing. The cave a person is afraid to enter holds the treasure he is looking for. He must have said that sentence 1,000 times, and he meant it precisely. The fear is not an obstacle placed in front of the thing. The fear is the reliable indicator of where the thing is kept. So the sacrifice was built into the doctrine from the beginning, and it was not incidental. Something must be given up, a security, an approval, a version of oneself that other people found convenient, and the giving up is not compensated in advance. He was clear that a person does not receive assurances before setting out. The assurance, such as it is, arrives only afterward, in the form of a life that fits. And there is no honest way to promise it to someone standing at the mouth of the cave with nothing yet given. By the early 1970s, the whole structure was in place. He had traced the hero's road out and back. He had followed the masks of God from the animal shrines of the Ice Age to the private mythologies of the modern novelists. And he had arrived at a single instruction, no longer than 4 words, that told a person how to begin. There was nothing further to build. What remained, and it turned out to be almost 20 years, was the giving of it away. In lecture halls and small auditoriums, on ships and in seminar rooms, to audiences that grew steadily, and then, at the very end, enormously. He had spent his whole life reading in silence. He would spend what was left of it talking and travelling and looking with fresh eyes at the far side of the world. He left in the late summer of 1954 on a Fulbright, and he was 50 years old. It was the first time he had crossed into Asia, though he had been reading about it for 25 years. And he went the slow way, by ship and by rail, keeping a journal as he went in the steady hand of a man who had been taking notes on other people's books since he was a boy. He would later publish those notebooks, or rather they would be published for him, and they carry a curious double weather. The exhilaration of a scholar finally standing in front of the thing itself, and the slow, faintly embarrassed disappointment of a man discovering that the thing itself is not the same as the books about it. India was the disappointment. He had come out of the Upanishads and the Puranas, out of Zimmer's lectures on the Indian art of the temple caves, expecting a civilization still breathing inside its own symbols. What he found was a modern nation in the first years of its independence, preoccupied, quite reasonably, with sanitation and industry and the political arithmetic of survival, and treating its own mythological inheritance either as a museum holding or as a nuisance to be modernized past. The temples were crowded, and the priests wanted money, and the young men he talked with in Delhi and Bombay wanted to discuss steel production. He wrote in his journal, with some asperity, that he had come to the land of the sages and found it full of committees. It was an unfair remark, and he half knew it was unfair. But the disillusion went deeper than irritation at beggars and bureaucrats, and he was honest enough to follow it down. He had committed the scholar's oldest error, which is to fall in love with a civilization's texts and then expect its living people to be the texts walking around. India, he decided, had not betrayed its mythology. It had done what every living culture does, which is to carry its inheritance forward in a form altered by need. And his grief was not about India at all. It was about the discovery that the golden age he had been reading toward had never existed anywhere at any time, and that the vitality he was looking for could not be found by traveling to it. Japan was the awakening, and it arrived almost without warning. He came in the spring of 1955, and something in him unclenched. It was not that the Japanese were more devout. If anything, they were less. It was the aesthetic, the way a rock garden and a tea bowl, and the interval of silence between 2 notes of a flute were all doing the work that doctrine did elsewhere, and doing it without any doctrine at all. Here was a culture that had taken the sacred out of the temple and distributed it evenly through the ordinary day. The placing of a stone, the sweeping of a path, The exact angle at which a bowl was set down. He had spent a quarter-century arguing that myth is not a set of propositions to be believed, but a way of experiencing the world. And in Japan, he found a whole civilization that seemed to have quietly agreed with him some centuries earlier and stopped talking about it. Zen delighted him precisely because it refused to explain itself. He liked the story, told in a dozen forms, of the master who answers a metaphysical question by pointing at a cypress tree in the garden. And he liked it because the pointing is not evasion. It is the entire answer. Nothing is hidden. The mystery is not behind the world. It is the world, seen without the film of one's own commentary laid over it. Something of the two countries stayed permanently paired in his mind after that. And out of the pairing came the piece of Indian thought that would matter to him longest, which he had read about for years, and only then began to understand from the inside. The Kundalini system describes a series of centers arranged along the spine, each one governing a way of being alive. And Campbell took it not as physiology, but as a map of human motivation. The most exact map, he thought, that any tradition had produced. At the base is the impulse simply to hold on, to survive, the gripping of the animal that will not let go of its life. Above it is the drive to reproduce, the whole immense weather of desire. Above that is the will to power and mastery, the impulse to conquer, to be seen, to prevail. And he thought it fair to say that the vast bulk of human history has been transacted in those first three chambers, and that all our newspapers are written from them. Then the map turns. At the level of the heart, something opens. And what opens is compassion. The sudden, inexplicable recognition of oneself in the suffering of another creature, which cannot be derived from any of the three motives below it, and which changes everything above it. Beyond that lie the centers he described more carefully and with less certainty. The purified word, the vision of the two aspects of the divine as one, and finally the crown, where all imagery falls away and there is nothing left to say. He never claimed to have traveled that road himself. He claimed only that it was the most sophisticated diagram of the human interior anyone had drawn, and that its great value was diagnostic, that a person in real difficulty might do well to ask, quite plainly, which of those chambers the trouble is being conducted in, since a grief at the heart cannot be cured by a victory at the level of power, and a hunger at the base will not be argued away by any amount of philosophy. He came home changed, and the change showed first in the classroom, and then in the lectures. Beginning in the late 50s, he had started speaking at the Cooper Union in Lower Manhattan, in the Great Hall where Lincoln had once spoken. And he kept it up for more than 20 years. They were free. They were open to anyone who walked in off Astor Place, and they filled. He would take a subject, the mythology of love in the 12th century, the shaman's journey, the symbolism of the Mass, and talk for an hour and a half without notes, following the material wherever its own logic went, circling back, doubling, telling a story from the Iroquois, and then one from the Grail cycle, and then letting the audience feel the seam where the two joined. He was in his 50s and then his 60s, a compact silver-haired man with an athlete's posture and a Manhattan accent, and people who had no interest whatever in comparative religion came back year after year because he was not lecturing at them. He was thinking out loud at speed with obvious pleasure, and pleasure is contagious in a room. From those lectures came the book that finally reached the general reader, Myths to Live. Spy appeared in 1972, drawn from talks given at the Cooper Union over the preceding years, and it did something none of his earlier work had attempted. It addressed the present tense directly. It asked what a person is to do who has been raised inside a religious inheritance that no longer holds in a century whose science has dissolved the old cosmology entirely, and who nonetheless wakes at 4 a.m. with the same questions the cave painters had. He wrote there about schizophrenia and the mystical journey as 2 passages through the same water, one drowning and one swimming. He wrote about the moon landing, which had happened 3 years earlier, and argued that the photograph of the Earth from lunar orbit was the founding image of whatever mythology was coming next, the first picture of the whole of home, with no borders visible on it. He wrote about war and about the young, and about the collapse of the local myth in a world where every people now lives next door to every other. The book sold steadily and went on selling, and for a great many readers, it was the door through which they entered everything else he had written. The same year, 1972, he retired from Sarah Lawrence. He had been there 38 years. He had taught by then the daughters, and in a few cases the granddaughters of his first students, and he had never taken a chairmanship, or built a department, or acquired a doctorate, having concluded in the Woodstock shack that a dissertation would require him to know less about more subjects than he intended to know. He left without ceremony and immediately became busier. There were seminars now at Esalen on the California coast, where he went for a fortnight each year and talked to a very different audience with the same steady erudition. There were tours and shipboard lectures, and a widening circuit of invitations from people who had heard a tape or read the book. And there was Hawaii. John Erdman's family had roots in the islands, and the two of them began to spend longer stretches in Honolulu, in an apartment with the ocean out beyond it, until it became the second home, and then very nearly the first. He kept the New York apartment on Waverly Place, with its walls of books, and he went on working the way he always had, at a desk, early, for hours. But the rhythm softened. There was swimming. There was the long light. There was a man approaching 70 who had done what he set out to do at 25 and had no plans to stop. Sitting at a table between 2 oceans with the accumulated notes of half a century around him, and the beginnings of an atlas taking shape. What he could not have predicted, and what nobody around him predicted either, was that the largest part of his audience had not been born yet when he retired, and that the last decade of his life would carry his voice further than the whole of the 50 years before it. It began, as these things often do, with a young man reading a book he had not been assigned. In the mid-1960s, a film student in Southern California came across the hero with 1,000 faces. And years later, having written and rewritten a space adventure that he could not get to hold together, he went back to it. George Lucas had a story about a farm boy on a desert planet, a wise old man, a captured princess, a father who was also an adversary, and he had drafts of it that sprawled and stalled and refused to find their shape. What Campbell's book gave him was not material, but architecture. The old scholar had spent 5 years in a shack reading the stories of the world, and had come away convinced that beneath their infinite local costumes ran a single sequence, a departure, an ordeal, a return. And Lucas, reading that sequence laid out with such patience, recognized the skeleton his own imagination had been reaching for without knowing its name. He said afterward that had he not encountered the book, he might still be writing the thing. The films that followed were, among many other things, the monomyth in the vernacular of the 20th century, and the fact that half the world watched them without ever hearing the word monomyth was precisely the point Campbell had been making all along. The pattern does its work whether or not anyone can name it. They met eventually, and the meeting had a symmetry the older man clearly enjoyed. Lucas invited him north to the ranch in Marin County, and Campbell, then in his late 70s, sat in a private screening room and watched the 3 films through in a single stretch, one after another, in the company of the man who had made them. He came out of it delighted, not, one gathers, out of vanity, though there must have been some pleasure in seeing the argument of a lifetime confirmed on that scale, but out of something more like relief. He had spent decades insisting that mythology was not a museum of dead beliefs, but a living function of the human psyche, and that a culture which had lost its inherited stories would not simply do without, but would grow new ones out of whatever ground was available to it. Here was the proof, in a form nobody could argue with. A wholly modern tale, machined and electric, that moved through the ancient stations without a stumble, and moved millions of people who had never read a line of Homer or the Upanishads. He liked to say that the old myths had spoken of a world that no longer existed, and that the artist's task was to find the images in which the eternal could appear again. Lucas had found some. That was enough. It was at that ranch too, in the spring of 1985, and again the following year, that the cameras were set up for the conversations that would change everything. Bill Moyers, a broadcast journalist with a divinity degree and an appetite for long questions, had been talking with Campbell on and off for years, and had come to believe that what the man did in a room could be caught on film if the film simply got out of the way. So they built the whole thing around getting out of the way. 2 chairs, a camera, a journalist willing to be led and to ask the plain, almost childlike questions. What is a myth? Why do we need them? What happens to a people who have none, that permit a scholar to answer from the depth rather than the surface? 24 hours of tape were shot over those sessions, at the ranch and later at the Museum of Natural History in New York, in the very halls where an Irish Catholic boy had once stood in front of the totem poles with his neck craned back. Anyone who has watched those tapes remembers the quality of the man's attention more than any particular sentence. He was 81, and he spoke the way a river moves, without hurry and without hesitation, reaching for a Navajo sand painting and a passage from Schopenhauer and a scene from a film he had watched last month, as though all 3 lived on the same shelf, which for him they did. He had been in classrooms for half a century, and the classroom had taught him the thing that no amount of erudition can supply on its own: how to say a difficult thing once, simply, and then say it again a second way for whoever missed it. Moyers asked about the meaning of life, and Campbell, rather than answer, redirected the question. People are not seeking the meaning of life, he suggested, so much as the experience of being alive, the feeling of aliveness resonating in the body and the innermost being. It is the sort of remark that could sound like a slogan, and does not, because he had spent 60 years earning it, and through it all, threaded across the hours, the phrase that had been forming since the Woodstock years, and had been said aloud to Sarah Lawrence undergraduates for decades: follow your bliss, spoken now to a camera, which meant spoken to a country. He did not live to hear it. The recording was done. The editing was underway, and the broadcast was set for the following year. And in the meantime, the old rhythm resumed. He and Jean were in Honolulu, in the apartment above the water, and he was working on the historical atlas of world mythology, the vast project of his final years, an attempt to lay out the whole development of human mythic imagination from the Paleolithic hunters forward, volume by volume, with the maps and the images and the archaeology all in place. It was to be the summation, the thing the Woodstock reading had always been preparing. He completed the first volume and much of the second, and left the rest as notes and outlines and gathered plates, which is very nearly the correct ending for a man who spent his life insisting that the great story is never finished, but only handed forward. He was still at the desk in the mornings. He was 83, and he swam. And he went out to lecture when he was asked. And he had the particular contentment of a person doing at the end exactly what he had chosen at the beginning. The illness that came was cancer, discovered late, and it moved quickly. There was a short hospital stay. He died at home in Honolulu on the 30th of October, 1987, with Jean beside him, 50 years married, the dancer and the scholar who had made a life together out of two disciplines that were secretly the same discipline. He had written long before about the mythological understanding of death, that in the traditional imagery it is not a subtraction but a passage, that the hero's return and the hero's departure are the same gesture seen from different sides. It would be sentimental to claim that this made the loss easier for the people who loved him. But it did mean that when the end came, it did not find him unprepared, or arriving at a subject he had never considered. He had considered it his whole life. It was, in a sense, the subject. The following spring, in June of 1988, public television broadcast the conversations in 6 parts under the title, The Power of Myth. What happened then was without precedent for a series of that kind. Millions watched. They watched again when it was repeated, and they bought the companion book, which went to the top of the bestseller lists and stayed there for more than a year. And they bought the audio recordings and lent them to friends, and they went looking in bookshops for The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which had sold slowly for 2 decades after its publication, and now sold in quantities its author had never imagined. Letters arrived at the house in Honolulu, addressed to a man who was no longer there, from people describing the shape of their own lives back to him, saying that they had recognized the pattern, that they had understood at last what the difficult passage of some particular year had been for. There is an irony in it that he would have appreciated and probably did anticipate, since he had watched the same thing happen to other men's books. He had spent his working life in the company of the illustrious dead, Zimmer, Jung, Joyce, the anonymous authors of the Vedas and the Grimm collections, carrying their material forward, editing what they had left unfinished, translating their difficulty into English that a 19-year-old could follow. And then, at the very end, he became one of them. A voice on a tape, a face on a screen, an inheritance passed to strangers who would carry it forward in ways he could not supervise. The teacher who had insisted that myth is not owned by its tellers had become, by dying just before his largest audience arrived, exactly the kind of figure his own theory described. Some of his colleagues found the fame unseemly and said so. Some of the criticism that would follow him afterward began in that moment, when a lifetime of dense comparative scholarship was compressed into 6 hours of television and a phrase that could fit on a bumper sticker. It is a fair complaint, and it will need answering. But it is worth noticing what the audience actually responded to, which was not simplification and not consolation. It was a very old man who had read everything, sitting in a chair, declining to tell anyone what to believe, and saying instead that the images are not the truth, but the pointers toward it, that the sacred is available wherever a person is willing to look, and that the life waiting to be lived is the one that has been quietly signaling from the periphery all along. The boy who had stood in the museum was by then 76 years gone from that afternoon. What remains is to see what he had actually been carrying since then, and whether the buffalo and the totem poles were ever really left behind. They were never left behind. That is the simplest way to answer the question the whole life poses, and it is worth saying plainly before the more complicated answers are attempted. The child who stood in the Great Hall of the American Museum of Natural History in the second decade of the last century, looking up at the carved poles brought down from the northwest coast, was looking at the same thing the old man in Honolulu was looking at 8 decades later, when he sat at his desk in the mornings and worked on an atlas of world mythology that he already knew he would not live to finish. The material had grown enormous in between. The Sanskrit had been learned, and the German had been learned. The 4 volumes had been written. The tens of thousands of pages had been read in a shack in the woods, and in libraries, in Paris and Munich, and in the reading rooms of a college in Bronxville. But the object of attention had not changed at all. It was still the astonishment of a boy who had been taken to see a show about the American West and had discovered, sitting in the sawdust smell of Madison Square Garden, that the people being played as the enemies of the story had a story of their own, older and stranger, and full of animals who spoke. Everything that followed was an elaboration of that afternoon. He would say later, with the mild amusement of a man describing a fate rather than a choice, that he had never really left the subject he had picked up as a child, that the whole career had been a matter of following one thread wherever it led. It led, as it turned out, through medieval French romance and Hindu metaphysics and Navajo sand painting and Joyce's Dublin and the Grail Castle and the tide pools of Monterey and the shrines of Kyoto. And it led back always to the same recognition, which is that the human imagination, wherever it has been left alone long enough to speak, tells versions of a small number of stories about departure and ordeal and return, and that these stories are not entertainments, but instructions, which brings the paradox of the opening to its resting place. He was raised a Catholic, seriously and devoutly, in a family that took the Mass as the center of the week and the year. He lost the creed in his 20s, in Europe, among the books, and he never took it back. But he did not lose the religion. What he lost was the belief that the images were facts, that the virgin birth had happened as a gynecological event, and the ascension as a matter of altitude. And what he gained in exchange was the conviction that the images had been pointing all along at something the literal reading could only obscure. The boy in the museum had already made this discovery without having words for it. He had seen the priest raise the host, and he had seen, in a photograph or a display case, a shaman raise a rattle, and he had noticed that the gesture was the same gesture, and the intention was the same intention. What the adult scholar spent 60 years doing was assembling the evidence for a child's perception. He kept the religion by giving up the claim that it was his alone, and by that trade, he found it everywhere, in the Bhagavad Gita, and in the Eskimo hunting songs, and in the Psalms he had learned as a boy, and never stopped being moved by. The criticisms deserve a hearing, and they are not trivial. Scholars of particular traditions, then and since, have objected that the comparative method flattens differences that matter, that a Yoruba initiation and a Greek mystery and a Christian baptism are not three performances of one underlying rite, but three distinct things with distinct histories, and that to place them side by side as variants of a single pattern is to lose precisely the specificity that makes each of them what it is. Others have argued that the monomyth was drawn too heavily from a narrow sample, that the hero he described is more often a man than a woman, and more often a warrior than anything else, and that the pattern was tightened by selection until it seemed inevitable. Still others have found the emphasis on individual fulfillment too congenial to the culture that received it, a philosophy that could be absorbed without friction by a society already inclined to believe that self-realization was the point of a life. These objections are worth stating carefully, because the honest response to them is partly to concede them. He was a generalist working at a scale where detail necessarily suffers, and he knew it, and he sometimes defended the generalization more confidently than the evidence permitted. But the concession does not empty the work. What he was after was never a proof that all religions are secretly the same. He said the opposite often enough, and he spent 4 long volumes documenting how radically different the mythologies of the world are in their tone, their politics, their conception of what a person is and owes. What he claimed was narrower and more interesting, that beneath the difference there is a set of biological and psychological constants, that every human being is born helpless and must separate from the parent, must meet the fact of death, must find a way to stand in a world that did not consult them about being placed in it, and that the stories cultures tell are the shapes given to those constants by particular landscapes and histories. Difference is the surface, and it is real. Sameness is the substrate, and it is also real. He was pointing at the substrate, and the pointing has a cost, and he paid it. He died on the 30th of October in 1987 in Honolulu, after an illness that came quickly, at the end of a life that had been remarkably robust. He was 83. He had worked that year on the Atlas, had lectured, had continued the reading that had never in 6 decades been interrupted for long. Sean Erdman was with him. The conversations he had recorded in a barn in California 2 years earlier had not yet been broadcast, and the phrase that would become inseparable from his name was still, at the moment of his death, a piece of advice known mostly to students and to the readers of a few books. There is a way of describing this as a misfortune, and it would be an easy way, but it is not the truer one. He had lived the shape he described. He had answered a call in childhood, refused nothing, gone away into the years of solitude that every version of the story requires, come back with something to give, and spent the remainder handing it over to whoever would take it. That the largest handing over occurred without him, present, is not a tragedy, but a completion. The boon, in the pattern he had spent his life mapping, does not belong to the one who brings it. It belongs to the community it is brought to, and the return is finished when the hero is no longer needed to hold it. He had written, in the book that made his name, that the modern person must find the way alone, without the guidance that older societies provided, and that the labyrinth is thoroughly known, and requires only the courage to go where the fear points. He did not offer himself as a guide. He offered a map and stepped aside. And then the stepping aside was made literal by the calendar. What he left was not a doctrine, and it resists being made into one. He never asked anyone to believe anything. He was suspicious of belief as a category, holding that it substituted assent for experience and made a wall out of a window. What he asked was much smaller and much harder, that a person attend to what genuinely enlivens them and organize a life around that attention rather than around the ladder that happens to be nearest, and understand that this will cost something and that the cost is the price of the thing. He said that people must be willing to let go of the life they had planned in order to have the life that is waiting for them. And he meant it as a description of an ordeal, not as a reassurance. The letting go is a real loss. The waiting life does not arrive gift-wrapped. But he had watched the pattern often enough, in the texts and in his students and in his own 5 years of reading with no salary and no prospect, to believe that the transaction is honored more often than caution predicts. And so the buffalo and the totem poles come back at the end, as such images do. A boy in a crowd, watching men on horses under electric light. A boy in a museum hall, standing beneath cedar carved into faces that had been made by people who understood something his own church had forgotten how to say. Between that afternoon and the last morning in Honolulu, there is a straight line drawn through 80 years, and every book on it was written to explain what the child had already seen. He liked to say that myths are public dreams and dreams are private myths, and the sentence is worth carrying into the dark because it points both ways. It means the great stories are not the property of specialists, but the common night work of the species, told aloud in daylight because they were dreamed first. And it means that the dreaming a person does, alone, unremarkable, unrecorded, is made of the same material as the Odyssey and the Grail and the Buddha under the tree. The world is having a dream, and each sleeper is a small chamber of it. That was the last thing he was saying. In the chair, in front of the cameras, in the barn in California, in the autumn light. And it is a quiet thing to be told, that the imagination does its own work while the arguing mind rests, that the images rise unbidden and know where they are going, and that the oldest instruction any tradition ever gave was simply to lie down and let the story continue without supervision, and trust that it has been told before,